Hello everybody, Raven Knight here. It's been a bit since I did a Lore Tidbits video, but that was mostly because I was struggling to think of what else to talk about, or rather what things I'd like to discuss. So I decided, let's talk politics. Ooh, yeah, not always a fun thing to talk about, right? But if there's one thing left very vague in the world of For Honor, it's how the factions govern themselves. And, well, in a world of war, I think it might be important to at least have a basic understanding of the governmental structure of these factions, yeah? So, in this video, I'm going to go through the Knights, the Vikings, the Samurai, and the Wulin. We'll probably talk about the Outlanders another day, and I'll break down how their governments and people function. Please note that all of this is based on my own personal interpretation of the lore and my own headcanon. Do not take any of this as gospel or necessarily accurate. The devs may change or provide a context of their world and make some of what I say here defunct, but until they do, I'm just going to assume all of this is accurate in my own head. So, let's begin, and we'll start with the Samurai. I want to start with the Samurai because they're honestly the easiest to break down, as the For Honor campaign actually does a little bit of explaining on their government, although I don't know if it's accurate to historical scrutiny. The Samurai have an emperor who governs over the Mire, and as of now it is believed to be Ayu from the campaign who reigns as Empress of the Mire. How she's doing as Empress, well, we're not quite sure about. We also know that the people of the Samurai are ruled by daimyo, or feudal lords who command clans or groups of samurai to oversee and control territory. Now, I would leave the discussion there, but there's another aspect to consider: the Emperor's champion. At first, I was ready to write them off as just a really strong warrior, but it seems they may have some sort of social or military influence. Note how Seijuro says in the campaign,
the Emperor's champion. Heading our armies again.
So it seems that the Emperor's champion commanded the Emperor's armies. That would be a shogun. So it seems that the Mire practices an imperial structure as it was intended to before the Kamakura period, where the shogunate began in Japan. The original idea of implementing a shogun was to be servile to the emperor. See, the emperor was the head of the state. The shogun was the commander of the emperor's samurai army, and all daimyo would be answerable to the shogun. Historically, at the end of the Heian period, the shogun realized a truth that the emperor overlooked. Why should I bend to an emperor when I command the military? So the emperor became more of a figurehead that the shogun would essentially pay homage to, but then, just kind of take all the power away and to make it so that anything the emperor does has to be done with the shogun's permission, right? So then by the Edo period, the Tokugawa shogunate had such unquestioned authority that Japan entered a period of isolation and peace for 300 years without major war or conflict. It would seem that, in For Honor, this rise of a shogun to power never happened. It seems that in this world, the emperor maintained their authority and the shogun kept their place beneath them. This is demonstrated in how the emperor's champion was imprisoned for defying the emperor and was only freed by Ayu and her clan during the Great Raid. It would also explain why the emperor's champion didn't obey Ayu when she said they should leave. If the emperor's champion was the shogun, Ayu has no authority over them. What might have happened here is the emperor stripped his champion of their status and imprisoned them. Ayu freed the champion out of desperation and necessity and tried to assert some authority, but was reminded that the champion is answerable to no one, and though not officially the champion or shogun anymore, they still retain their aura and audacity, and well, let's face it, Ayu's not going to argue with the shogun.
They're burning the city.
We're leaving. I said we're leaving. Let's go.
We can't.
This is how you ended up here in the first place.
Now, taking all of this as it stands, I believe that the Mire is organized similar to the historical feudal Japanese model. The Mire is divided up into various provinces and territories controlled and overseen by a daimyo. There can be various smaller families and clans within the territory, but all are subservient to the daimyo. Now, the daimyo themselves are subservient to the emperor, who can command them as he or she sees fit. In the event of an emergency or crisis, full authority over the military may be turned over to the emperor's champion or shogun, so the emperor can focus on restoring state and standard functions. While it is ordered that the daimyo not invade or make war with each other in the interest of common peace and focusing on their foreign enemies, this doesn't stop the daimyo from plotting and scheming against each other under false pretenses and making clever moves to invade and take from each other. All kneel to the throne, but they hold animosity in their hearts for one another. That's just the way of the daimyo. The value of land in the Mire is determined by the strength of its daimyo and their clan, as well as the amount of resources the land can supply. A territory near the water that draws in fish has great value, as does one that can grow a large amount of rice. A land that can't produce much resources is considered poor territory and is often overlooked by their neighbors, but that also means they likely need to raise up strong armies so that they can attempt to take territory from others if they see an opportunity. Now, in actual Japanese history, the Edo period saw the implementation of a weapons ban where no social class other than the samurai could carry weapons. This was done in an attempt to prevent peasant uprising and also to basically ensure that there was no challenging the samurai authority. But that wouldn't be possible in the Mire, as the land is in perpetual war and citizens would most certainly be forced to fight to defend themselves. So for that reason, average citizens could probably keep weapons, but they would not be paid for by the daimyo or clans. They had to see to their own purchase and upkeep themselves, so otherwise the peasant class is primarily concerned with day-to-day upkeep of the Mire. Reverence is given to the samurai class and all who would defend the Mire from their enemies, and that is pretty much how the samurai run their day-to-day. I hope that makes sense, because that's what I got for you. Let's move on to the Vikings. The Vikings have very little internal structure revealed to us. We know that they have jarls who rule over clans or groups, and these warring clans fight amongst each other as often as they fight against their foes. This is because the Vikings value conflict and competition. To earn favor for the gods, they have to prove themselves in battle, and so it's near impossible to have a lasting peace in Valkenheim without one clan stirring up trouble for the others. So, here's my take. In general, Viking society is managed by the local jarls and chieftains. Jarls act as governors and heads of clans. They forge alliances, declare wars, stake claims to holds and territory, and act as symbols of both strength but also justice. While the clans certainly do fight amongst themselves, they do have a sense of uniformity and cohesion that goes beyond their warring nature. A brotherhood, you might say, and this is shown through Gudmundr and Svengard. Svengard, if you'll remember, was a food and grain storage outpost. It held the food reserves for the winter months. Burning it caused a severe famine in all of Valkenheim, and Gudmundr was a jarl so revered and recognized that he was the one entrusted to guard it. This reveals a few things. First, it tells us that the Vikings do share resources for emergency situations, and that there is a definite need and desire for cooperation and alliance between the clans. And second, it means that Gudmundr was a jarl trusted by all the clans to be impartial and fair in guarding and distributing the supplies needed for other clans. There had to be a fear that biased parties might try and send more food to a favored clan and less food to a disliked one. But to choose Gudmundr meant that all the clans agreed he was a fair and honorable individual who would show integrity and honor in how he handled his task. And third, it reveals that despite what Ragnar said to the Lone Raider,
"Child, might as well ask me to pick up farming. We're Vikings." So that's a no. Valhalla.
farming is a crucial and necessary part of Viking life. So to that end, I believe that the Vikings of Valkenheim are primarily governed by the Jarls and are trusted to deal with their own clans, territories, and affairs, like I said. However, there has to be some form of government in which the clans can work together or communicate in the event of crisis, or to elect Jarls in charge of places like Svengard. For this reason, I believe there may exist a High King or Queen of Valkenheim, a specific Jarl or warrior chosen to act as an impartial voice and body for all of Valkenheim in the event of conflict that goes too far, internal crisis, or massive external threat. The Lone Raider may have been chosen to take up this post, or perhaps it was Stygander. If not a High King, then some kind of council or conclave for Jarls to meet in peace. We know that unity and alliance can and will happen in Valkenheim given the right incentive. Apollyon even feared that this would happen if all the food of Svengard was burned. The Vikings would unite.
This food, why are we not burning it all?
What do you imagine the clans would do if we burned it all?
They'd starve. Die.
They would unite. But leave them scraps. Just enough for 2, maybe 3 clans. They will fight each other over what remains. The wolves among them will rise. We're not here to kill them. We are here to teach them who they are.
The Vikings would unite, surviving as a greater collective and actually become a force to be reckoned with, but make them desperate as well, and allow the Jarls to prey on each other, preventing any form of cohesion or unity to form. They might not unify so easily and might fall on each other. See, the people of Valkenheim live harsh but rewarding lives. Farming, fishing, metalwork, and construction are all highly important to the people of Valkenheim, and thus these jobs would be in high demand. Any plunder taken through Viking or any goods created through regular work would be the property of those who produced or took it. However, a percentage would have to go to the Jarl's family to maintain the stability and function of the clan. From their clan, a tithe would be collected to go to the national treasury and storage vaults for use in times of difficulty or strife. So in this way, Valkenheim maintains its life of war and battle while still keeping itself prosperous and active. Law and order is maintained and overseen by the people. While a Jarl may have the final say in any legal circumstance, in general matters of law, things are handled by the people in collectives gatherings called things, where laws can be heard, interpreted, and enforced. And as for matters of war, the Vikings hold to clear standards. It's seen as dishonorable to fight and kill an injured or weak enemy who can't defend themselves, because that's not honorable. That doesn't please the gods. Killing children is usually frowned upon. Plunder taken from raids is the rightful property of the one who took it. However, all of that should be noted that these rules that I just said tend to only apply when Vikings war against other Vikings. Against their neighbors, the knights and the samurai, well, the rules change a bit. Sure, it's still not honorable to kill injured or weak combatants, but they are enemies. Killing women and children isn't really liked, because you could turn them into decent slaves instead. Plunder that's taken that goes into the Viking war effort as a whole, and it can be burned to the ground to do so, yeah, the rules kind of change a little bit depending on who they're fighting. But to put it simply, of the factions, the Vikings likely have the greatest amount of freedom, but comes at the cost of having the most savage outlooks and approaches to life. So take that for what it is. And now, let's move on to the Knights. The Knights value order and structure. For this reason, the Knights would have very clear and laid out forms of hierarchy and systems of government, which is odd because the Knight lore tells us little about their self-governing. We know that there are various Knight legions, each one tasked with defending Ashfeld from external threats, and the strongest of these legions is the Iron Legion. We also know these legions answers to specific masters or warlords like Apollyon, who was the leader of the Blackstone Legion. It's also common for Knight legions to have inner circles or councils who govern them. But frankly, this is probably only the surface level of governing. So here's how I see it. Ashfeld has to have a central government run by a king or queen, a monarchy to establish law and order, and this monarch is answerable only to the church itself. Thanks to Apollyon, we do know that there are religious churches and ceremonies in Ashfeld. She mentions them.
The children of Ashfeld claim to all follow the same god. But I have sat in their services and listened to their hymns. They do not agree on the laws of their master. And most of them do not follow their own ideals.
So if this functions anything like medieval Europe, Ashfeld has a theological foundation for its laws, and anything the king or queen chooses to do must be scrutinized by the church. This law in place would likely be one built on honor, moral, and also structure. Keep in mind that the knights had to rebuild themselves from a cataclysm that nearly destroyed them and saw them preying on each other. So these laws are likely about how civilians should be treated, how knight warfare should be waged, and how punishment should be administered. If the monarch makes a law or decree, the church acts as the messengers and spokesmen who tell the people of the law and explain it. The peacekeepers act as the enforcers of the law, stalking in the shadows and assuring that people obey and don't break the laws. That's why they're called the peacekeepers. They literally maintain the peace in Ashfeld by acting as the police force and the inquisitors. They might be versed in the law as well and how to enforce it. As for the legions themselves, their formation and structure is a process in and of itself. Most smaller legions are formed as offshoots of existing ones, and larger legions tend to be formed from smaller legions amalgamating into one large force. For a new legion to be formed, 4 conditions must be met. The first condition, the Legion must have a clear knight commander, a leader who has been blessed and sanctioned by the monarch and vouched for by at least 2 other Legion knight commanders. Second, the Legion must house at least 4 lawbringers for every 100 soldiers. Lawbringers act as the internal commissars and chaplains of their legions, not only maintaining internal command discipline, but also charged with exacting punishment to those who break their orders or codes. Third, the Legion must have a base of operation they are housed out of, which can only be approved by the monarch and the regional lord or governor who owns said land. The governor has the right to bequeath the land to a legion in exchange for a tithe or tax, unless made exempt by the monarchy. And fourth, the Legion must have a clear and established code of ethics and discipline that is approved by the church, the monarchy, and the knight commander. These 4 conditions are non-negotiable, and any legion that failed to meet these conditions and still attempted to continue operations would be dubbed excommunicate traitoris and subject to not only censure, but eradication. Unquestionably. Of course, as we know, not all knight legions perfectly exemplify the code of ethics that Ashfeld claims to uphold, and there are plenty of times that the monarchy will look away and ignore blatantly cruel or inappropriate actions in favor of maintaining peace and stability, because that's one of the dark things about being obsessed with maintaining peace and order. Sometimes you look away from obviously immoral things to make sure order is maintained. However, it is also known that the knights represent security and safety for Ashfeld's people, so it's not a good idea to allow for all knight legions to act too out of control. You need a system and state of discipline. The greatest boon for Ashfeldians that other regions lack is an incredibly fertile and prosperous land for agriculture. Ashfeld has a temperate climate that lends itself to ideal crop yield. Further, because of the volcano Mount Ignis's magma rivers often rolling into Ashfeldian lands more readily, the land gets the benefit of volcanic and rich soil, which is high in nutrients and minerals, meaning more animal and plant life can flourish here, so food and resources are not lacking in Ashfeld. But that said, it also means that they are the target of other forces such as the Vikings and samurai, who would seek to stake claim on these fertile lands. So for that reason, particularly around outlying cities and towns, martial law would likely be a very common occurrence because you need individuals who are willing to do what's necessary in wartime. So that's pretty much how I view the Knight Legions. So now to wrap things up, let's take a look at the Wulin. The Wulin are particularly difficult to pin down because they aren't one uniform group anymore. At one point, they were just one warband and a long list of them fighting for dominion of China after the Cataclysm. However, Gao Lei, their self-proclaimed emperor, saw that China simply wasn't worth fighting for and decided to seek a new empire in Heathmore. At that point, they were more unified and controlled, with a singular emperor to command and direct, with generals and commanders to govern on the micro level. There would have been non-combatant civilians as well, but largely kept out of the fighting as much as possible and safe in Chang Pass, until territory could be claimed for settlement, of course. However, after the fall of Gao Lei and the forcible conscription of the Wulin to the service of Horkos, things changed drastically. Now, with no emperor to act as their singular commander, the different war parties and armies of the Wulin are now leaderless and forced to rely on their own generals and commanders for direction. This leads to different warlords and generals leading with different priorities and goals in mind. Some, like General Zhe, want to become the new emperor of the Wulin and reunify the Wulin army into one massive force with themselves at the head. Others, like my own Tian Qilong, simply want to provide their armies and their families with a secure future, wherever that may be. Laws and order are dependent on the whim and will of the general. The amount of civilians in each individual army will depend also on the needs of the general and how he chooses to supply his troops. Some will take to raiding tactics, stealing from conquered territory to feed and supply their troops. Others may take on to mercenary ways of living, fighting for different groups and causes in exchange for money, food, and provisions, and yet others might simply be nomadic, settling the lands they have claim to and making a living there. So there are lots of ways you can interpret a Wulin band and how they govern themselves. To be perfectly honest, they're the hardest ones to pin down because there are so many different ways the Wulin, smaller bands and companies could be managing themselves. It kind of just depends on which one we're talking about. But that is me going over all of the major factions in For Honor and how they likely govern themselves. Again, this is all my own headcanon and my interpretation of the lore. We may do the Outlanders another time once y'all tell me if you like this series. Let me know if you like this video, and if you want me to do the Outlanders as well, would really be happy to do it, but wanted to test this out first. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.